Well, very welcome. I really appreciate your time. No.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure.
So tell me, can you tell us a little bit about your background? You grew up in South Africa, right? You were born in South Africa, but you left pretty soon to go study, right, abroad?
Yeah.
The base?
Yeah. No, yeah, I was actually born in London. But that's another. But I went to South Africa when I was 2, I think, and my father is South African. My father's family are South African.
Okay.
And my mother's Australian. But so I grew up in Joburg.
Okay.
Yeah. And indeed, I left quite young. I left when I was 16 to Moscow to go and study.
Wow.
Yeah, which was quite a quite a change in the scenery and culture and environment. Yeah.
So at the age of 16?
Yeah. Yes.
Sure. I mean, that must have been quite a culture shock, but not only culture, but language, right? It's,
yes.
Yeah. Can you speak Russian?
I can speak Russian. I mean, my Russian has become rusty because I've not lived there now in 10 or 11 years.
Yes.
But if I start reading a book or if I start talking to a friend, then it comes back. It's kind of, and, yeah. No, so, but it's funny because,
No. So you went from Russia to Amsterdam?
To the Netherlands.
To the Netherlands,
yeah.
Okay.
First to The Hague, and then I did my master's in The Hague for 3 years. And then I stayed in The Hague for like, I think 1 or 2 years after I finished the study, and then I moved to Amsterdam. Which is just 40 minutes away in the train. So, I mean, it's, it's such a small country that, And now, and I live now in Amsterdam.
For how many years now is it already?
Now, I've been in the Netherlands now for 11 years already.
Sure.
Yeah, since I was 20. Yeah.
And when did you start bass? When did you start playing bass?
So, I started bass, I think it was when I was 12 years old. It could have been 11, but I can't remember now exactly how old I was. But I think 12. And before that, I played the violin.
Okay.
And before that, I played the piano with very little success. And the bass, it was kind of a funny thing because the violin I really enjoyed, and like piano I didn't enjoy. Piano was just kind of, it was like the teachers at my school said, "Oh, this child is really musical. He really should play an instrument." And I already sang in the choir when I was very young. And then, and so piano was sort of the logical instrument, and we had a piano in our house. And I mean, I enjoyed it, but I just didn't enjoy the idea of having to practice so much. And of course, on piano, you have to, eventually on all instruments, you have to practice a lot. Yeah. But on piano, it was kind of, I didn't get, like, I thought, well, it's nice for fun, but why would I be a slave to it if it's just for fun,
Yeah.
And then at a certain point, my grandmother bought me a violin, which was very special actually. And I don't know where that, I don't know where that came from. I don't know what, I should actually ask her. But suddenly there was a violin and she had bought it for me, and I was like, oh wow. And I was fascinated, and I started having violin lessons, and it was just like magic for me, And the piano was not. The piano was like, you hit a key and a note comes out. It's very obvious, but somehow the violin had this kind of, I don't know, this really magical quality. I was like, how did, especially if I saw somebody really playing it really well, I thought, how are they getting that out of that, out of the sort of wooden box. But at a certain point, me being me, I guess, I was in a string ensemble at school, and the string ensemble consisted of, I think, like 10 violinists and 1 cellist.
Yeah.
And I thought, this is really like, this was really, I found it kind of disappointing that everybody else played the violin as well. I thought, oh, it made it somehow a little bit less special in my eyes. And at that moment, when the teacher was tuning, like, it was the age where your teacher tuned your instrument.
Yeah.
She was tuning like violin number 9, and I looked, and in the room where we rehearsed, there was a poster of musical instruments, and it was a poster with a whole lot of instruments from the orchestra, and there were also Middle Eastern instruments and a few Chinese instruments. But there was a bass, and they were all drawings, but there was a bass, and I mean, the bass took up a lot of space. And I looked at it and I thought, I've never seen somebody playing that. And so then that day I went home and I said to my mum, I think I want to learn double bass.
Awesome.
And that was,
that's how it started.
That's how it started. Yeah.
But listen, we specifically today want to talk about Bach on the bass, right?
Yes.
And transcribing Bach for the bass. Now, I've personally played a few Bach movements out of the cello suites on bass.
Yes.
And it's let's be honest, it's extremely challenging, right?
It's very challenging. Yes. Yeah.
And I'm just curious, first of all, where did your love for Bach started? Especially to play it on the bass. And when I watch your performances, I can really tell you have a great affinity for it. So where did it start, and what is the first Bach piece you've played on bass?
That's a good question. I think actually, if I'm being very honest, I think the very first Bach piece I played on bass was
Badeneri.
Yeah. Exactly. Because I remember we would do, as being a bassist, of course, quite early you start already learning excerpts. And at that age, I didn't quite get that an excerpt. I don't think I quite understood the concept that it was something that actually is just apart from a bigger whole. And anyway, and so my teacher, she would give me Mariechen. She would just give me excerpts sometimes, and that was, I think, probably the first piece by Bach I actually played.
Awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah. It's great. It's a great bass line.
It is.
As is a common theme in Bach's music.
Yeah.
But I don't. The funny thing is, it's something that it sounds a bit funny to say, but if I look back sort of go back in my memory, it was something that's a bit like blue cheese to me. Like I had to. It wasn't one of those things like, for instance, Vivaldi was music that as soon as I heard it, I was like, wow, this is just incredible. I guess I think I was like 10 or 11 or 9 or something when I first heard like Vivaldi, Four Seasons, Nigel Kennedy. And I was just like, well, this is just like the greatest music I've ever heard. And with Bach, it was a slower introduction for me. And at a certain point, when I was a bit older, and I'd been playing the bass maybe a few years already, Bach, his music was something that I'd obviously come in contact with, but I hadn't yet really sat down and listened. And that was sort of the day when you would go to the CD shop and on a Saturday, and you'd go and find new music, and I remember I saw a recording of the Goldberg variations, and bought it and went home, and it just doesn't sound very pleasurable, but I forced myself to listen to it from beginning to end. Because I don't know, there was something in me that thought that I guess just through sort of the atmosphere, I understood that Bach's music was somehow was ultimately fundamental to all of classical Western music that would come after it. And so something told me, I thought, if that's the case, that there must be good reason for it, and it's worth then really making myself listen to it and see if I can understand what that is, the sort of genius of Bach. And so that was, I think, the first time that I really started to take it seriously. If that, and I'm glad I did, because now I find it incredibly beautiful. I mean, there's nothing more beautiful. And then the first time I started playing like the cello music on the bass, I think it was either the prelude of the first suite in an arrangement for bass, or it was the prelude of the D minor in A minor. I can't, but it didn't make much of an impression on me at the time, and I think that's simply because, as you say, it's a big challenge. And when you're not already familiar with the music outside of learning it through your instrument, sometimes just all of the challenge can kind of overwhelm the music, and you kind of think, I don't know what this is all about.
have you played or performed all the suites on what? So what Bach have you already performed and played on bass?
Yeah.
Did you just do the gamba sonatas or?
I did indeed. When I was in Russia, I learned the second gamba sonata.
Okay, nice.
I think that's the second one. But that was also in an arrangement that actually later, I don't know, it's a tricky one. Like now, if I look back, I actually wonder if it was a good arrangement, because it was very difficult, it was very low, and somehow that music, I don't know, especially when you play it with piano, it becomes something very different, I think.
Yeah.
And so that, I think, was definitely the first thing that I played, like really, as a piece in public. And now I have, because, at a certain point, sorry, I'm going a little bit from one thing to the other, but it is how it, in my sort of musical life,
that's fine.
Bach has been a little bit like that. I remember, so to answer your question, I've performed now all 6 of the suites.
Yo.
And I have you've caught me at a good period, because I'm in the middle of recording all 6 of them. And so
Even so the number 6.
Even number 6, but there's a really, I don't think, I'm definitely not the first person to think of it, but if you play number 6 in G major, so if you start at, then, it's still really difficult, but it becomes, it brings it into the realm of possibility, and it becomes comparably difficult to how difficult it is on a 4-string cello. That's kind of what happens. And so and what I've done for the recording is I have different strings, which unfortunately I don't have on now because it's completely changed the instrument, where the bass is tuned up a 5th. So then you have D, A, E, and a B string, and it's quite incredible. Because the bass, it really transforms it into a different instrument. I mean, the distances stay obviously as far apart, so you don't gain anything in that, but you do. The sound world becomes very different. And one of the things about the 6th suite that I always find so special, especially when it's played on a 5-string cello or a spalla cello, so it's like a sort of mini cello that's held on the sort of not quite on the shoulder because it's really big, but kind of just off the shoulder. And there's a lot of people think it was probably written for that instrument. Is that the sound is so different than all the other 5 suites. It's because it's so high, it takes you somewhere else.
So it's D. A.
It's D, A, E, and B.
B. Okay.
So it's kind of like you have solo tuning. And then you move them all 1 string down, and you put a high D string up. Okay.
So do you use solo strings for this, or do you use?
This is a good question. So there's I was very lucky, I think it was maybe now probably 3 years ago, to come in contact with a string maker in Berlin. His name is Gerold Gensler. And he makes strings, and and I have a set of his strings now on me that he made for this bass, and they are gut strings, but they're wound, so they're not as thick as raw gut. And I asked him, because of course you have high C tuning, so that would be then, exactly. And I said to him, I was like, well, if you have high C and you just put it all up a tone like solo tuning, then how would that sound? And he told me that he had done it for some people and nobody liked it. Everybody found the sound was it became like a gamba, a viola da gamba. And he said it sort of took it too far out of the realm of the bass. But for this suite, I was kind of very convinced that this would work, especially because somehow with gut strings, because I had once before experimented with like a high C or a high C, but it was steel and it sounded so unpleasant. It was so shrill, and the warmth that you have, you know, if you play like up and down position on a bass, you didn't have it anymore, and it was kind of like, you know, it was not very pleasant. But I've noticed if you ever get the opportunity to play on period instruments, so if you play on like a D violone, which is kind of in the realm of the bass, that's great. But if you play on a G violone, which is higher, then suddenly you're playing on an instrument that is big. I mean, it's maybe a little bit smaller than this, but it has, I think, 6 strings, and the highest strings are really high, and it sounds really good. Yeah. And so I sort of, you know, I knew some gamba players and violone players, and just trying that, I thought, wow, but this sounds so good. It should sound good on a bass as well. Yeah. And so he made me a set of a high D set, so the D, A, E, and B, and I put it on, and it sounded great.
So it's not something that's for sale. It's not,
yeah, I mean, that's a little bit of a pity. But that being said, what you can do, and I started experimenting with this before, but it is a bit of an expensive experiment, is you can order raw gut strings.
Okay.
And you can order violone strings and put them on your bass. It is a bit, it's a tough one, because then you also have to get used to playing on gut, which is of course really quite different. Yeah. But once you get used to it, it's great. Yeah. And the scary thing about it, like I did it with 1 string, and the string snapped, and I was like, oh, you know. So it's kind of, and apparently back in the day, the bassist Maggie Urquhart from the orchestra of the 18th century, she told me the way they would figure out what strings worked is they would just put them on, and they would tighten them up until the point that they snapped, and the note just under that point would be the point for the strings. You know, and I said to her, I was like, oh, okay. She said, of course, that, you know, that's going to be an expensive way to find out what works. But yeah.
So when you transcribe Bach for bass, is there specific idiomatic technical aspects that you keep in mind? So I mean, now that I know you use a different tuning for the 6th suite, like, is there specific tunings that you also prefer for the 5th suite? Different keys. How do you feel about playing the suites in different keys than each original? Because I know also there's a lot of discrepancies of bowings. Some people prefer to do the Anna Magdalena original bowings, and so can you tell me how do you view it or envision it?
Yeah. Absolutely. I think these are such good questions, because I think, and for me at least, they inform decisions when tackling or transcribing music from any period. So I think the place to begin, and it might sound very obvious, is to look at the time period in which the music was written, and try and sort of take yourself there and see what was happening. And that sounds a bit abstract, but I mean it simply as, so indeed, like you say with bowings, indeed, there's the Anna Magdalena. And what's very interesting to me, and I don't have it with me, there's a very good Badenreiter edition of the suites, is that the cello suites are one of the rare pieces of music by Bach for which there is no manuscript in his own hand. Right? A lot of things we have, like the violin sonatas and partitas, we have the manuscript from Bach, so we know exactly he wrote this down, and he wrote slurs, and he wrote slurs here, he didn't write slurs there. So it's very easy to look and say, well, this is what he had in mind, you know, and not to say it's the gospel and there's absolutely no room for interpretation. But it's always nice to, you know, because of course what's written on the page is a means of getting it out of the head of the composer and into the player of somebody else. So it's always nice to have that as a starting point. For the suites, we don't have that. And the closest thing we have is Anna Magdalena, so his wife's manuscript. And that we do have. And so it's very interesting. There are, I think, 4 sources that are used, and the Anna Magdalena is the earliest. Then there's another one that's a bit later by somebody else, and then 2 others that are later. And it's very interesting to see what happens with the bowings, indeed, because in the Anna Magdalena, it's very specific, actually, most of the time. And you know, I mean, I have it here. I keep on sort of pointing at it, but it's because I have it here, and I sort of want to, you know, double check what I'm saying is true. But I know the very first time that I tried to read from manuscript, I thought, oh gosh, it just all looks like chicken scratch, and it's really difficult to, you know, to figure out what it is. But it's actually not. It's actually very precisely written. And of course, every now and then there's a slow where you think, is this over 2 notes or is it over 3 notes? And then of course, you know, you have to play detective a little bit. But my point is, it's very interesting to see how the slows have changed from that to sort of 2 or 3 editions later, especially in something like the first suite, where, you know, it's very standard to play just 4 in a bow all the way till the end. And if you look at what she wrote, I mean, there's very little that's, you know, 4 to a bow. And so, I mean, it's, you know, I can talk for too long about that. But anyway, so go back to the source. That's always a good way to begin. And so for the bowings, that is something that for me really helps. And I mean, sometimes, and there are of course 2 great books written about this by Anna Belsma, the Dutch cellist, who really kind of dove into this, and he sort of published a book with his own interpretations of the bowings, which is very helpful, I must say. And it's sometimes interesting, especially his first book was about the first 3 suites, and the second book was about the second 3. And especially in the first book, it's very interesting to see how he interprets some, like I say, sometimes there's, you know, a question of, is this 2 or is it 3 notes? And he, you know, and he has that question sometimes as well, and then he'll sort of refer back to other passages that look similar. It's a really nice book to read because it's very easy. It's not high academia, you know. I mean, it's very friendly. It's the way it's written. And then about the tunings, my philosophy on the tunings is you have to find something that works well on the bass and that makes the bass sound good, because there is indeed sometimes this idea of, oh, well, this was originally written in D minor, so we have to play it in D minor. But what's really funny is if you look, again, looking at the period, if you look at Bach himself, and if you look at all of his contemporaries, they would rewrite music all the time. And they would take music from friends, from colleagues, from people they didn't know, and they would rewrite it for completely other instrumentation. And they would change the key. And Bach would do this with his own music as well. And you would see that, you know, that when he would change a piece, he would keep the instrument in mind, you know, he would then rewrite it for a different group of instruments or a different instrument. And I mean, there's a really, really good example of this in the cello suites, and that's suite number 5, which he then at a certain point rewrote for the lute. And I mean, I discovered this myself very late. If you listen to the lute version, he adds, and if you see what he wrote, he adds all kinds of harmonies which he doesn't write in the cello version, because the lute has so many more strings, you know, it's so much easier. And it's extremely inspiring to hear, because then you hear the difference between the essence of the music and the sort of execution of the music. And so I think it's really important that and it's tough making a transcription, I think, of a lot of stuff for bass, because, you know, we have such unique challenges on our instrument. But I think it's always good to sort of stop sometimes and think, what is the essence of this piece or this phrase or, you know, this passage, and is it coming across in the way I'm transcribing this? And so with me personally, with the suites, it meant that I changed the tuning quite often. So for instance, the G major, the first suite and the third suite, I do in a what's his name, a Joel Quarrington tuning.
Cool.
So D, G, C. Fifths except for the top. So the top stays at a 4th.
I see. G.
And what that gives, I mean, I can show you very quickly. I'll just have to put this on. So you tune your A down to a G, which on nearly every instrument, suddenly the instrument sounds better, which is really crazy. And then you tune your E down to a C. Yeah. And then what happens is you can play the whole E. You have this beautiful open G string, and it's an octave lower than the cello. So you can even, if you wanted to, you can even play. You can add something to the music that makes the music even better than it is. Yeah. And it's something that you can only do on our instrument. And then suddenly it's like, oh, this is great on the bass, you know?
I'm really loving this discussion. This is really cool.
Sorry.
No, you want me to go practice now, so it's really. No, that's really interesting. You know, even though it's over Zoom, I can already sort of hear like it's
right.
No, it's awesome. So I just want to have a quick look on the time.
Yes, yeah, sorry.
No. We still have like 2 to 3 minutes.
Okay.
Why, not what.
Yes.
Why do you think it's important to study, play and perform Bach on the bass? And why would you advise young people to do that? Because I know there's sort of two minds to playing Bach on bass.
Yes.
And for me, I've always found that you don't necessarily have to make a CD, you know, when you play Bach on the bass.
Absolutely.
But the whole point of playing Bach on bass is you learn something from it that you really need to know. As I feel as any musician, actually. So what is your point on that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I think, you know, I think the magic of this music, and especially the cello suites, and even the violin pieces, and not to say that you have to learn those on the bass, I mean, you know, but to listen to them or to, you know, to just study the scores, is that you really understand the role of the bass within Western classical music. Yeah. You know, the tension, the structure, it all goes through the bass. And when I say the bass, I don't obviously mean just the double bass, but I mean the function of the bass. Yeah. And you know, and it's fascinating how, and it's more so in the cello suites than in the violin partitas and sonatas, because he had a limitation of the cello. I mean, you know, the cello, I mean, arguably now it can, but then it couldn't do quite the insanely virtuosic chords and counterpoints that the violin could do. So there's a lot where Bach will take the listener on a line where half of the line is almost imagined. You know, you get these notes. I mean, a very good example is like the fugue from the Fifth Suite. He has this whole fugue, and often you have two voices going at the same time, but they're not actually playing at the same time. You know, it's all inferred. And it's such a genius way of giving a complete piece of music with an incomplete thing, as it were. So just a like solo instrument. And I think what's so valuable about that is, you know, as a bassist, we are not only the fundament, but we're also the rhythm section, you know? And it's often easy, especially in classical music, to forget that because sometimes our role gets a little bit confused. And what's great about this music is it's kind of, whenever you're in doubt about something, you just have to ask yourself, okay, what's happening harmonically? And that will usually answer the question for you. Are we going here? Or are we coming away? You know, these kind of broader questions. And so I think it gives, I mean, this is in my experience, it gives a very good understanding of our role actually in music. And what it also does, but this is on a more sort of abstract level, is, and it's one of the things I find most remarkable about this music by Bach, is that, you know, in his time, everything was about structure. So, you know, you have these 6 suites, and every movement in terms of structure is almost the same from suite to suite. I mean, you know, it's like a formula, it's like a pattern.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you have 2 gavottes, and then in 2 others you have 2 minuets, and then in 2 others you have 2 bourrées. In all of them you have a sarabande, in all of them you have an allemande. And I find it fascinating that he, you know, I would think if I was given the task, and not that he was given the task, he gave it to himself, but of writing, you know, 5 different pieces, but they all have to follow the same structure and formula, I would end up with 5 pieces that all sounded the same. You know? And somehow he has these 6 works, and they all sound completely different. But the structure is the same. And I think that's kind of, again, this is a more abstracter lesson to be had. But you can kind of see how limitations can make for the best creativity with something like that. And how within structure you can kind of find freedom, and you can find beauty. And for me, that's kind of reason enough to study it and play it. I
absolutely agree with you, and I love your answer. I think it's very true. So thank you so much for your time. I really
thank you for having me. It's such a lovely, it's really, really nice chatting with you.
Hopefully we can meet in person one day.
Yes, definitely. We'll make it happen. Don't worry. Definitely.